about. So maybe we could start with a 5 to 15 minutes, somewhere in that range, whatever you're comfortable with, of how you come to be in this, and what's driving you. So I start with, I'm really honored to be here. I've really appreciated the kind of interaction we've had thus far, and that's my starting question for you. It's like, who are you? How do you come with the passion and the expertise and experience you have that has led you to what you're doing?
Well, I started out as a research director in an advertising agency, and one of the things I was assigned to do is to find out how much repetition, what kind of exposure kids needed to learn themes, like advertising themes. And so I went to the libraries, I looked the stuff up, nothing, no studies, nothing. So we started to experiment with kids and bring them in and teach them things they didn't know. And the more I worked with kids, the more I thought, wow, this is where it's at, not in advertising. I love to work with kids. And I found them so fascinating because they were so logical. And if you made a mistake, they showed it with their behaviors. So then I tried to get into education. I had no background in education. And I went to, at that time, one of the most prestigious institutes there was, the Institute for Research on Exceptional Children at the University of Illinois. And I made a tape of me teaching really young kids, like 4-year-olds, algebra, and they're solving all these problems. And I presented to Carl Bereiter and James Gallagher. And they were the first ones. I tried other places, lots of them. They were the first ones who looked at it and said, wow, do you think you can do that here? And I said, oh, sure. And so they ended up hiring me. And it was, like the happiest day of my life up to that point, just about, because even though I was working for a salary of, way less than what I was getting in algebra, I really felt I was doing something that I should be doing. And from then, we started working with disadvantaged preschool kids. And they were hard to teach, hard to manage relatively. So they forced us to learn all kinds of principles and rules about how to present and how to manage in a way that we could get them to learn what we were teaching. And we developed sort of a theory, not of learning, but of instruction, which is pretty much different from a theory of learning. With learning, you're talking about what goes on in the organism and how it occurs. When you talk about teaching, you have your independent variable, which is whatever you're presenting to the kids, sensory data of some kind, and your outcome is their behavior. That's the dependent variable. So those are what you have to work with, and that's what you have to deal with. You don't have to go into the brain, into the mind, into other things. These all exist, but they're perfectly irrelevant to the problem of how do you get this kid to learn X? How do you get it so that the kid's automatic at it? How do you get it so that it's right? And how do you get it efficiently? I mean, it's one thing to be able to do it over a period of 2 years. It's another to put the smile on the Mona Lisa with one brush stroke and get it done in 2 weeks or less. And nobody has really taken up on our orientation, like the field has not accepted our orientation to teaching. And, frankly, they don't understand it.
They don't. This is part of the great conversations we were having, is how to build a bridge between those that are more humanistic, learning-centric, and helping them appreciate the benefits to those things that they value of an instructional approach like you're describing.
Right. Well, one of the parts of the bridge, I think that's really important, is that they don't have understanding of implications from kids' behavior. Like, kids make a mistake. They have trouble learning something. What's the typical routine the traditionalists for the past 80 years or whatever have used. Give them more exposure, try to do it a different way without any particular logic to the new way, or put it lower in the grades. So at one point, fractions, 6th grade, that's when kids learn it. Now 4th grade, whoa, they have trouble learning it. So instead of trying to figure out how to teach it better, they just lower it to the point now the fractions are in kindergarten, where kids have nothing approximating the pre-skills that they would need to put it in place and understand it. So it's insane. The other thing they do is clout. They're clumsy in terms of instructional design. With clout, it just means, well, they have trouble with fractions. More practice in fractions. More practice in fractions. More practice in reading. Come on. If you're not teaching it, it's not practice. They're telling you with their mistakes what you're doing wrong. You're doing something wrong, and you need to look at their mistakes for qualitative information about what you need to change to do it right. And they don't do that. And there are like hundreds of examples, and some of them are kind of irksome to the extent that like if you look at it from a strictly instructional standpoint, phonemic awareness is a skill that's necessary for beginning reading. If you look at it the way they look at it, it's a thing, kind of a general amorphous language thing. But we came about, like we did phonemic awareness, strict phonics, explicit phonics, decodable text, where nothing was in the text they couldn't read, and control over some things that they haven't even got around to yet by, for example, syntax and some of the other sentence details and comprehension skills. And that we arrived at how to figure these out, not from some theory of phonemic awareness, the brain, any internal functions or language. It had to do with mistakes kids showed us that they needed something. And it went like this, that if you give kids a task, like without good preparation, and you teach them the sounds of words, and you're working with low performers, and you present them a task in which they're to sound out this word. Touch the letters and sound it out, the words mat, and they go, t. And you see, they even pronounce the sounds. It's not ta, it's at. And then you say, okay, what word is that? And they say, at. And you say, well, coach, come on, what word is it? And at. Or some kids will go, at. What word? At. Okay, they're telling you something. They're telling you that you have a stinko program and that you need to go back and fix the damn thing up so you teach what is necessary for them not to make that mistake. But they're telling you exactly what they need. They're showing you which part of this complex task they're having trouble with. Are they having trouble with looking at those letters and identifying the sounds for the letters? No. Are they having trouble, identifying them in sequence, going from left to right? No. All that's been taught. So your program's adequate to that extent. They are telling you that there's a verbal component you screwed up on, and they don't have, and if they don't have it, all you're going to have to do is use brute force because there's no cute way you can show it. But if you use a good program, you'll say, wait a minute, let's take of that complex task, let's just take out the verbal component and let's leave all the rest. And just take the verbal component, and before they ever get up to having to sound out words or that, we'll teach the verbal component. And the verbal component goes something like, okay, listen, at, say it with me. Get ready? Again, say it with me. At, say it fast? Yeah, what word? Great. And now, when they read the word, they have a background that makes it far more likely they'll be able to identify that word without making that dropping the initial sound or not being able to say it fast. Also, it gives the teacher a correction. And that's one of the biggest rules of any systematic sequential instruction is that anything that occurs later in the program should be correctable by presenting something you taught earlier in the program, because if the program is well designed, that's why you taught it, so that it would buttress against mistakes now. So if a kid makes a mistake, like makes the same mistake, we make no assumptions. The kid can make the mistake, even though we've got the phonological component, and, by all it's holy, shouldn't have problems, but maybe just because of the complexity of the task, putting it all together, kid makes a mistake. So he, at, what word? At. And you say, okay, listen. At. Do it with me. Get ready. At. What word? Man. Okay, now do it down here. Touch the letters and say the sound. Same thing. See, you already know how to do it. And with a couple of corrections like that, the kids don't make the mistake. Then there's one more. Like some of the kids still tended to have a little trouble with, blending. So that what we did was, instead of doing at, which is, traditional way, we made the unblended word closer to the blended word by having them do it continuously. So it actually sounds more like the real word said slowly, like mat. Again, mat. Say it fast, mat. Now we got them. Now we have designed the program based strictly on feedback, or a component of the program, based strictly on feedback that they gave us, and they told us, showed us with their behavior exactly what they needed. So if you don't make assumptions, you can do that. If you make assumptions, you're going to screw up pretty badly. And unfortunately, a lot of stuff that's still going on today is making some horrible assumptions about kids without having evidence of how kids respond to it and using that evidence to fix up the program sequence. Like phonological awareness has become a thing, so that they do things which are insane for beginning reading, like phoneme segmentation, where you'll say a word and then have the kid say the phonemes of the word. Well, to a great extent, the phonemes are perfectly arbitrary. A lot of them, the vowels particularly, have multiple sounds. Like A is not a uniform sound. It's A, like that. And O is always cleaner, but E is probably the only really good one. So breaking a word into phonemes is an arbitrary task to an extent. And so if you don't show them what the phonemes are, they're not going to be able to do it. But all you need to do is work with kids, low-performing kids, on segmentation, for instance, before they've learned to read or anything. And you have to ask yourself two questions. One, wow, what can I do to fix up this problem? Because it's really hard for these kids. Well, what you could do is teach them a whole bunch of other things so they would know the phonemes that they're going to use before they use them. And the second one is, now given this, what's the application of this? Spelling. Right, but do we really expect them to spell before they read? No. So wouldn't it be a good idea to first introduce them to a whole bunch of regularly spelled words so they know the game of the relationship between, the sounds they say and the letters or letter combinations? And then at that point, give them a little bitsy thing that would require now about this much, because by learning to read the words, they've already learned most of the important skills that they need to do the spelling thing. So they only need a bridge of phonemic awareness or segmentation about that big before you could introduce spelling. Effectively. So, the point, I think, that hasn't really caught on is that you're going to design a specific sequence, and you're going to design it so that it is slick, which means that everything is in there for a purpose, and all complex tasks have been composed of elements taught earlier and that you have found out how to refine this and fine-tune it by trying it out with kids. I mean, they're the ultimate judges in this court, and if they make mistakes, they're telling you, fundamentally, you goofed up. And they're also implying exactly what they need to know.
Good. Let's stop there for a second. I want to check this setup. Do you want to do something with light distance? Or did that adjustment help?
It helped. I'm going to move them back just a tad.
Okay. Do that. Because I'm not on the tape, I can continue to talk to you and we can set up the next part while the camera's running. We're just going to make a little adjustment here.
Okay.
Just a bit.
One of the things that I really like about what you're saying, and I think is really important, is that this really is where assessment should be.
Right.
Right?
Yes.
And our general sense of assessment right now is way downstream from what we're attempting to measure in our assessments.
Right.
And so the whole loop between intervention, action, assumption, intention, measurement, and then looping back to adjust it is way out of time sync with what's actually happening to children and learning. And that this is a problem that runs across the board from day one through university, really.
Right.
But it's very critical in these developmentally precarious windows that children have to go through with respect to the artificial learning of codes, reading, spelling, mathematics, etc. So,
yeah, absolutely. Do you want me to?
Yeah, go ahead. Let's see if you can bridge this into assessment in your language in a way that's kind of as much as you feel comfortable with, connecting the dots like I...
Right. Well, smart assessment should be based on problems kids have. So if they have problems learning a particular thing, or if they have problems in the process, then you should have some kind of assessment ongoing that lets you know whether they're stumbling. And another problem with assessment is remedy. That if you give vague remedies or elaborate remedies, it's unlikely that anybody's going to follow them through. But if you have them designed within the context of a well-designed program, the remedies are fairly easy because you end up with the program designed so that it's like a stair step. Each lesson is continuous with the lesson from before. In fact, the rule we follow is each subsequent lesson, at the beginning you have to start, but each subsequent lesson teaches no more than 10% new stuff. And it's taught in tracks, so the kid does not do a unit on something. Rather, the kid each day works on sounds, for instance, then works on reading words in isolation, and works on reading a story, and then that's near the end because that tends to be the big reinforcer, and then doing some workbook activities that strengthen some of the skills that need to be strengthened. So every lesson follows that order or that regimen so that you're able to build these tracks that just introduce a little bit new every couple of days. And if that's happening in all the tracks, each lesson introduce about 10% new. So that basically what you're saying is that if the kid qualifies for the program, has enough skill to be able to do step one in the program, the kid will be able to go through the whole program. The kid will learn to read. And if it's a reading program.
Right, but that's the big if, right? On the one hand, you could black box the child in a way that you're talking about in terms of the outcome that you want and the intervention or educational system that you're going to put them through, and say almost independent of whatever their inner variation is, that the instructional objective in itself has a structure. It has itself
Sure.
has a series of progressions that the
Right.
child must go through relative to it, independent of them, so to speak.
Right.
And that plus feedback from them,
Right.
if we adjust to it, is what we need to move them down the line.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
But this comes back to how well our assessment of them lines up so that they're on the right starting
Right.
point going into it,
Right.
and how finally our ongoing assessment
Right.
allows us to tune our responses to them so that we're actually meeting what they need along the way in our steps.
Right. I agree totally. That translated into, this stair-step program idea, it means simply that you can use every single lesson, every single task, and every lesson as a test if you have appropriate criteria. It goes something like this. The kid must be at least 70% first time correct on anything that is introduced for the first time on that lesson. The kid must be at least 90% correct on anything that had been in, nothing gets taught in less than 3 lessons. It is never assumed to be taught unless it appears in 3 consecutive lessons. That if a kid enters and he's on level, it means that he'll be able to learn the new 10%, whatever it happens to be for that lesson. But okay, I'm sorry, I screwed up. That the rules for how you use the program as a tool for ongoing and absolutely accurate assessment, if you have a properly designed program, is the kids have to be 70% correct on anything that is introduced for the first time on that lesson. The kids have to be 90% correct on anything introduced in the last 3 lessons or to the beginning of the program. And you have, at the end of the lesson, the kid has to be 100% firm on everything. And the fourth is that you have to have the program designed so that the teacher can complete it in a reasonable period of time. Now, if you look at all those and you use all those criteria, it doesn't matter what mistake a kid makes. Like we've found empirically that people using programs, for instance, like in special ed, using our material in special ed, when we work with their kids or train them, we have to move the kids back something like an average of 80 lessons. In other words, they are so far from being able to teach to mastery because for those kids, the stair is here. They're down here somewhere. They're not even in the ballpark. So they could go through that program 3 or 4 times. It would do nothing because they are not evaluating or seriously looking at the skill level of those kids, largely because of prejudice. They think that, oh, you have to move them along, one, or, oh, those are special ed kids. They don't learn this stuff. Wrong and wrong. That if you place them properly, they will progress just like anybody else. That they may go a little slowly at first because they have to learn skills of how to learn from you or how to learn from adults.
And they may have confusion brought about by a fragmentary exposure to the things that are downstream from where they really ought to be.
Right. Oh, absolutely. Like when you take them back, now it's not just you're dealing with virgin subjects anymore. You're dealing with kids who have been contaminated. And so they're going to require more practice. Relearning takes anywhere from 3 to like 14, 15 times as much exposure. Like, and when we design a program, we design it according to whom we're dealing with.
That's a very interesting point. Let's deconstruct that a bit. Why is that so?
Okay. Well, first of all, the first decomposition would be evidence of performance, all right? So evidence of performance. When you work with, like one of the program series we have is corrective reading. And I'll give you a couple of phenomena of corrective readers that shows the problems that they have in learning. And that tells you a lot about the program you need. So One thing is that if you go through a simple story in which they can read 3 out of 4 words correctly, so it's within the ballpark, and you give corrections for the words they miss. No, that's not said, it's was. What were? Okay, read that sentence again, and just go through it low-key, kind of corrections like that. And then you have them read the story again. They will virtually always make more mistakes on the second reading than the first. Why? Because they can't take the information you've given. Why can't they take it? Because they have a history of not being able to take information from teachers. Teachers have told them things like, look at the first part of the word and guess what word that could be. Teachers have told them, read the context, think of the context. What could that word be? One of the reasons, big puzzle, why kids have great excitation in their language areas, poor readers do, is because they're trying to treat the task as a verbal task. They're trying to figure out the meaning before they read the word. In fact, we had one kid tell us this, that this was in a field tryout of one of the programs. The kid made a mistake, and the teacher said, no, sound it out. And the kid looked at her and said, tell me the word and I'll sound it out. And I thought, what a smart-ass kid. And then I thought, no, he said it all. That's it. That's what he believes. He has to know the word to sound it out. Another phenomenon that the kids make is when they read words in lists, they make fewer mistakes than when they read the same words in context. Why? Because in grade 1, teachers did eminently stupid stuff like have them look at the picture, discuss the picture, and then read the words. I'm sorry, Virginia, pictures do not generate specific words, but specific words generate certain features of pictures. So the proper order is read the words. What are you going to see in the picture? Here's the picture, not the other way around. Then another thing they do is it's always discuss, discuss, discuss. Frame, think, then read. Wrong. And that's what these poor readers are trying to do. They're trying to figure out, like there's some kind of crazy rules for them. And, obviously Shaywitz and a lot of others have demonstrated that it's not the traditional, oh, the kid can't see the word, or whatever. But they're trying to inappropriately approach it when it's in a context from the standpoint of context. What could that word mean? So they're forever making guessing mistakes and missing words that if you have them reading a list, they do fine. So what implications does that have for a reading program? All kinds. It means that you need unpredictable sentence structures. Why? Because they'll guess on the basis of sentence structure. Tim and John said, let's go to the lake. So Tim and John, everybody can complete that sentence. No, we would design that question or that sentence so that if the kid said, went to the lake, it would be wrong. Okay, why? So we can provide the kid with information at a high rate about how to change it, change that behavior. Related to that is like how you would reconfigure the program, the stuff they read in text. Like one of the things we did, for instance, there are other ways to do it. There's other ways to do all this stuff, as long as you know what the hell you got to do. Kids reading words and lists do better than reading the same words in the text. So what we did was we had a series of stories about this dog named Chi. It's named Chi because they had trouble discriminating chi and she and stuff like that. So, but I mean, it's all for a reason. Everything's for a reason. And it's basically largely influenced by kid performance. So when Chi gets upset or angry, she says random words. Oh, of, come, for, to, go. All the words that these kids have had since the first grade, and they're forever missing when they read in connected sentences. So they had, talk about a hell of a time, that they would try to read those and they would stumble on them simply because they were, nonsense in a sensible context, or what they thought was. But after a while, then they would get proficient at it. Also, after a while, like for the first few days, we have kids chart their errors in the program so that we can start to give them data that they are learning this stuff. And typically what happens is often on the second reading, they'll make more mistakes than on the first reading. And then after about 7 to 10 days, it'll reverse. And the kids will make more errors on the first reading, fewer errors on the second reading, and both of them will drop so there are fewer errors overall. So what does that tell you? That tells you they are now able to incorporate the feedback that teachers always assume that the kids can incorporate, but the kids don't know how to incorporate. They have found out that you mean what you say and that they can rely on the things you say. And the same with all of these others. But to design this program, you have to, okay, so I can give you numbers on this stuff.
Well, before you do, what I really like where you were going here, and what I'm hearing you say is that when somebody has to be remediated with respect to a learning objective, you said it takes 15, 16 times longer, right? And that the reason for that is that the way that they've learned to relate to instruction has created a confusion in them, and you've got to now design an instructional system that mates with their confusion and bridges them into having a trusting relationship with the coherency of your instruction now.
Right, and trusting in a logical sense, that they can believe what you say. They know that your words mean exactly what they say. But then how much repetition do they need? Through their behavior, they'll show you how much they need.
I would imagine that part of the 15 to 16 is a confusion at this level, but that another significant part in this is their aversion to being wrong or to being in a relationship with the teacher, how they feel about all of this.
Yeah, and largely they feel that they're going to fail. And like we work with some really tough kids, 16, 17-year-olders who are, incarcerated for murder and things like that, really tough kids. And it was kind of interesting working with them because here you'd see this real tough kid and you're teaching them, and it's frame one, they're learning this stuff, okay, go. And the first thing you have to tell them is this, like, you can't give up on me, okay? You cannot quit. And if you're going to quit, say it now and we won't even bother. I'm not going to give up on you because I know you can do this, but you cannot quit, because that's what they do. And you can see it in their behavior. Like, here's this tough kid. He's reading and he's, sounding out, or he's identifying this word. The man went, that's was. And here's his body. Like that. Like, what is he saying? He's saying, I knew it. I knew I couldn't do this. I knew it would be no better this time than it's been how many thousand of other times. How many people have, tried to do this with me? I mean, give me a break. I can't do it. And you have to tell, whoa, no quitting, back to the first word.
This is so critical. I mean, this what you're describing is this impulse to frame their experience in a way to take them out of this bad feeling.
Right.
Right. And this is happening to little kids. It's happening across the board. That this confusion is bringing about this dreaded shame that they don't want to have, and so they're trying to find some way to escape.
Yeah.
And so you're trying to hold them to a covenant that says it's going to be tough, but you can't. You got to agree not to try to escape.
Right. Yeah. I'm trying to get him to the point where I can show him his data, and the data shows him, look, see what you've learned. Because what often happens later on is that as the stories get harder, well, you want another rule? Here's a rule. That if a kid can read 9 out of 10 words correctly, and you change that text by introducing unfamiliar words so that he can only read 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 4 correctly, he will make way more mistakes on familiar words. He will make mistakes you haven't seen that kid make in weeks. Why? Because he's reverting back to his old strategies, and those are strategies where I don't know how to read. I don't know how to read this. I have to guess. I have to figure it out. I have to go through some mumbo jumbo. Oh, it's horrible. They feel really bad.
That feeling affects cognitive clarity.
Yeah. Well, like with these really tough kids, sometimes they'll start out like, and they'll say stuff like, "Hey, man, you don't expect us to do this bullshit. We're not doing this crap. That's kid stuff. They do that in the first grade. We look like first graders." No. Okay. And you just say, "Okay, guys, here we go. Everybody touch the first word. There's hands on the word, touching the first word and still talking that way." So what does that tell you? It's not for you. It's for the peers. They're showing that if they make a mistake, it's not because I'm dumb, not because I don't know how to read. I don't give a damn. I don't care about this stuff. And it's all a posture. But they care. You better believe they care. Like in this one place where we worked with kids, it was in a residential setting where they could choose different things, and they could do as many as 3 reading periods a day, and they didn't have to do any other schoolwork because they were older kids and weren't in school. And most of them would sign up for 3 reading periods a day. No kidding. They wanted to read with a passion. And, if you can deliver the mail, they'll stay with you. The reason they don't stay with most programs is there's no evidence that anything's going to happen.
It's the same old that feels like,
Right.
Here again, it's reconfirming something's wrong with me.
Absolutely.
And it doesn't seem to be going anywhere. I don't have any sense of traction that I can get out of the hole by going into this. All I'm doing is feeling bad still.
Right. And I want to be able to do this. I really want to be able to do this. That's the point that a lot of people miss. You don't know how important it is to them. Probably more important than it is to those of us who can do it or that we can imagine, because they want to feel that they're smart. They don't want to feel that they're dumb. And they know that other kids can do this. And boy, do they ever want to do it, regardless of how much they put
One of the
you
things we've found in so many of the people we've talked to is the enormous correlation between behavioral problems, social pathologies of various kinds,
sure.
that they fundamentally have their roots in learning-related
Right,
issues,
right.
having frustrated learning that's soured out to shame them in
Yeah.
a way that they can't handle.
Right, yeah, well, that I never say these letters right. NICHD, well, a lot of the studies they've done have shown that this most highly correlated with, teen problems. Not school failure is the greatest predictor of all the variables that they looked at.
I mean reading.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Learning to read particularly, yes. But to try to close the loop here, that they show you through their behavior how much practice they need. So we don't have to guess a whole bunch about how much more it takes. All we need to do is put them through the program and compare that with like an initial reading program where kids are virgins, uncontaminated, and how many repetitions it takes there. On many of these words, it would take like 7, 8 corrected repetitions. That doesn't mean that they were corrected. That means they occurred in a context where you knew the kid responded, and if the kid made a mistake, you could correct it. To learn some of these words, and some of the same words that the kids persistently make mistakes on, particularly when the text gets a little more difficult, a 4th grader might require like 60 repetitions. And a 10th grader might require, 400 repetitions, so that the numbers go up astronomically in terms of how long they've practiced it and how embedded the strategies are for them using the word. But it's big.
We were talking to a school psychologist a couple of days ago, and he said, as far as he was concerned, there ought to be an emergency stop button. If a kid isn't getting it, the whole thing needs to stop until he does, because it's just getting worse and worse and worse to continue on if he's not got this.
Oh, absolutely. That's why the lesson, like when we redid these classrooms that we worked with in special ed, like we would just quickly test the kids individually, place them in the program where they belong, and it was fine. I mean, we could do it really quickly. Of course, we know what kind of mistakes to look for and what, but like we could do a whole classroom, 20 kids or whatever, in an hour, and have them placed properly. And there should be gongs like that all over the place so that kids never get in a position like that, because what happens is that here you have a very carefully designed program, and it doesn't benefit the kid because the kid who's at mastery has to learn 10%. The kid who's down here would have to learn hundreds and hundreds of percent to be at mastery.
And be able to overcome how he's feeling about
Right.
it. She's feeling about it, which is working negative and negative.
Right, and also be able to do it in the one period. This kid learns 10% in the period. This other kid has to learn 600% in that period, and this kid historically is the slower kid. Does that make a hell of a lot of sense? Not to me. The kid you need at mastery is the lower performing kid. Okay, another fact, that if you work with smart middle class kids, I mean from a rich language background, as defined by some of the studies they've done with how deficient the vocabulary is for at-risk kids, like significant differences, or what's the name of that book? Meaningful Differences. Risley and Hart did this great book in which they counted the differences in interactions between middle class and disadvantaged kids. And on some of these things, it comes out to like, over a period of a couple of years, millions of repetitions different, millions of differences in exposure. So these kids are pretty far behind. And for them to catch up, you have to be scrupulously efficient. But if you work with lower performing kids and you don't bring them to criterion today, let's say you bring them to an 80% criterion, that if you test them the next day, they will not be above 80%. They'll be below 80%, or at best at 80%. You do the same thing with middle class kids who are familiar with successful learning, who have done a lot of that. You bring them or leave them at 80% criterion, and very frequently they'll come in the next day at 100% criterion. But if your sequence isn't so, if your sequence is not designed so it's sequential and so it addresses what the kid has to learn, like, a lot of corrective reading programs try to avoid the things that give kids problems. No, the game is to teach it properly and confront it. Why? Well, a simple rule of reinforcement theory, like Skinnerian, operant conditioning or whatever, is that if things occur at a low rate, they're very hard to change. Like if something comes up only once every 3 years, it's very difficult to establish any kind of program that'll make a big difference. But if you can get that behavior at a high rate, then you're in a much better you're in a much better position to give the kid information about what he's doing wrong, and that every time he does it wrong, it's for the same reason. And this, of course, this implies that if you were dealing with a severe behavior problem who did certain kind of tricks or whatever, went off under certain conditions, you would make it at a high rate so that he had lots of opportunities to run off and, then receive information about that goes nowhere. You're not getting reinforcement for that, but you are getting reinforcement for your appropriate behavior. So then, he'll let go of it in time.
So generally, we want to isolate and vivify the things that are going off in order to get
Absolutely.
feedback that's coming in timely enough to make any change about it.
Absolutely, yeah, and you don't hide from it. So instead of hiding from the mistakes that the corrective reader makes, we bring them all out in the forefront. Not in a way that it's going to frustrate them, but hopefully within. And the sequence for the corrective reader is nowhere as slick as it is for the beginning reader, because it's easier to map individuals because they haven't learned this stuff. So what they learn is a function of what you put in. So if you haven't put it in and you don't know how strong it is, it's more difficult to build a systematic program, but you can build it so that it has plateaus that give them adequate practice. And then when you go into the next phase, you're able to see what kind of problems they have. And the way you see it is to design that phase in a way that it puts the next problem you're going to confront in the spotlight, so it happens a lot. And then that will give them, like after a whole bunch of cheese stories, they got pretty darn good at reading those nonsense words, because and you tell them when they make the mistake, hey guys, you just read those words in a list. It's the same words. And they go, but after a while, then they get good at doing it.
You help them learn their way through these guessing habits that
Right.
they've accumulated, so
Right.
that their mind wasn't busy doing self-confusing things.
And you put it at a high rate. So every time, give them lots of opportunities to guess. So every time they guess, whoa, that's not the word, sound it out. Or, spell the word, or whatever, algorithm we're using at that time. But that's the one, and say, okay, that's what tells you what the word is. Spell it. Don't guess at it. Here you go. Back to the beginning of the sentence, read all the words, and away you go.
We were talking to a neuroscientist who specializes in neuroplasticity, and he was saying something that's kind of related to this, but on the affective side or the emotional side, which was, if it's something that we're angry about, or we're fearful about, or we're desirous of, or we got a high level of interest of, we'll learn it in 1/10 the time if it's something that we're only mildly interested in. In other words, the emotional intensity, the affective intensity, has an enormous effect on learning efficiency.
Right. Well, that's the way the organism is designed. But it ain't just humans. It's like dogs, cats, anything. Like I knew a dog that had an experience where during a terrible thunderstorm, he tried to jump out of this yard. It had picket fence. He caught his collar on the picket fence, and so he hung there for about 3 hours till his masters came home. And during that time, there was lots of thunder, lots of rain. Okay, so thunder and lightning like that occurs at a relatively low rate, so he never got over it. But he could predict weather like you would not believe. Long before there was a cloud in the sky, he'd start acting nervous and start hiding under a bed or something like that. And he's telling you he learned on one trial in a way that affected his whole life. And it was my dog, so I know.
So he became hypersensitive to reading the change.
I tried to desensitize it, but it was so ingrained. And I sometimes have people over there, and he'd start doing that. And I said, "Oh, it's going to rain," and they look. Sometimes rain is not forecast. I said, I'll bet the bank it rains. No, he could sense ozone changes or whatever pressure in the air, but he was absolutely accurate, and he learned that in one trial. So, and that's a pretty complex thing to learn, because all the things that are going down, which of these predicts rain? Which of these predicts this horrible experience? I mean, thousands of things are happening. But it's not the thunder, it's not the lightning, it's not this. It has to do with the air pressure or some ozone change or some trend that occurs. Like he could do it like 7-8 hours before it rained. I mean, it wasn't just, it's going to rain. Sometimes not a cloud in the sky, and he'd start doing that stuff. Anyhow.
Back to the kids.
Back to the kids. The big problem with this routine is that you get into the Sylvia Ashton Warner nonsense. Like her routine was that she would present words to kids, and if they couldn't learn it in one repetition, she'd throw that word away and try something else because it didn't have emotional significance to them. No, Virginia, you have to teach the kids these words. So what you need to do is to let them know that their role as a learner is important, that they can do it, and they're going to get significant reinforcement from it, including you're going to impress the daylights out of me, the teacher. I am going to be impressed with your accomplishments, and I'll let you know that I think you're pretty darn smart when you do things that are pretty darn smart. And we're going to arrange it so that a lot of smart things happen. And if you get positive reinforcement for that stuff, and it's significant to you, and you see that it's a useful tool, wow, I read better than Jerry, and he's in 3rd grade. I'm only in kindergarten. Wow, am I smart or what? But if you don't give them that evidence base, that it's important, and it's not just some dumb emotional game or intrinsic reinforcement or something like that. You have to make that input so it's going to work. And there are a lot of things you can do both within the program, like designing the program. Okay, like we've done a whole bunch of different programs, and they all, have very, very good track records. In fact, unequaled track records, period. And all of them are different from each other, and they're all built along the same principles, but not along the same actual words, sequence, or anything like that, or even conventions for prompting responses. Anyhow, this one that we've done that may be the crown jewel of them all is this CD program called Phonics. And it's really, really neat because it has a second reading of the story. So they'll first read the story, and it's just like an icon of a book, and there's a story, and it's on the screen, and they'll read the story. And then after they read the whole story without seeing any pictures or anything like that, now the narrator says, now we'll read the story again, I'll show you some pictures. And sometimes there's animation in there. And the second reading of the story is always, the words are always, it's more abbreviated generally, but the words are different. We don't use the same sentences.
But you're telling the same story, so the story's getting richer as they progress and get better.
And if they try to remember lines or anything like that, they get information the fast way that that's not working. But then, because it's the second reading, and, generally, we got to read the story again. Wrong. These kids look for, that's the high point of it all, because there'll be some cute animation in there, something in a lot of the stories, but it's unpredictable. So they don't know exactly when it's going to occur, but they do know that after they do this first reading and do a good job on it, they get to do the second reading. Yes! So, you have to work with the tools that are within your purvey, or you can't do it. And so you have more with with a CD medium, you have so much more latitude and so much more control, because now you can control the pacing, you can control the syntax, you can control what the kids see, and you can control really what's important, the timing of how things happen.
And I would think most importantly, you can gather feedback closer to the edge of the action.
Yeah. Well, not really. If you're a good teacher and you're doing, for instance, reading mastery, and if you've set the skills up right, and you've got a group of, say, like 10 kids, and they're reading these words in a list, next word, and the kids are reading the words. If you've set it up right, one kid makes a mistake, you can hear it. Absolutely. And you can correct it right then. And that's the level on which all programs have to operate. If they can't operate on that level, they are varying degrees, particularly for the beginning level. as you go farther up and the kids have more skills that make them autonomous and able to figure things out on their own, then they don't need these high rate support things. But you don't want a kid to go away from that group with a misrule on what this word means or what this word says.
Particularly in the early stage, you don't want them making mistakes that get through, that don't get caught,
Right.
that allow them to think that
Right.
they were okay about something that was
Right.
fundamentally off.
Right.
So your CD's not using voice recognition
No.
to
no.
check at that level
No, no.
of feedback granularity.
Well, we've been working on a version of it that Don Steely is a guy that works with us, and he's been working on a version of speech recognition for it for 2 years. The problem is that speech recognition, unfortunately, isn't all it's cracked up to be, particularly with kid voices.
There's 2 engines that are pretty stable and good now. The
Yeah.
one that Soliloquy is working on, that Marilyn Adams is doing in back east, and another one that I'm familiar with in the general Bay Area, Thinking Machines, that are actually tuning in to be able to make the kind of, sound level distinctions in the range of children's voices necessary to plug into these kind of programs.
Yeah, see, like our experience with, and I don't know whether he's done those engines, I suspect he probably has, is that when they're, the mistakes that they make when they're reading connected text, if they read very much, it's not, that for a few words or a list or something like that, simple stuff, but when they read connected text and you've got 150 stories and they're going to be reading them all, that it just overloads the machine, that you have to get samples of the kid's voice and get a match, set it up, and even after that.
Gee, that kind of says something about the complexity of the relationship between speech and text.
Yeah. Oh, well, in English, get the hook. I mean, Jesus, let's take a language, run it through Greek and Latin, screw it up, then, give it to the French, and then the Germans have to have a big shot at
And the
it.
Dutch printers.
Oh, yeah. And then when you're all done, then you'll go back to England again and get some medieval stuff stuck in there, and now you've got it. Except for your neologisms and
Yeah, it's pretty bad. We're coming up on a tape change.
Okay.
Maybe we should just go ahead and take a break and switch. Let's pick up what we talked about. Some of the things that, the myths and misconceptions that abound out there that you'd like to speak to.
Yeah, the myths and misconceptions out there are legion. There are still those who believe that kids learn sort of like very general things and then it becomes more specific. Like that's the sight reading approach, where you look at the general conformation of the word and you figure it out. And then later discriminations occur. It doesn't work that way. Because years ago, we had a lab right across from this other operation that did crazy stuff, like you see kids in there learning, disabled kids, big sandpaper A, this big, tracing it. And so I asked, well, why does a letter have to be sandpaper and big? Oh, multi-sensory input, and it had, they smell it, see it, touch it, and also poor visual discrimination. These kids can't discriminate. I said, is that right? I always, here, let's go outside. And it was during recess. And there was an airplane flying over in the distance there, and on the retina, it probably was a third of a degree or something like that. And I said, what is that thing up there? And all these kids said, look. What do you mean? I said, that thing over there in the sky, that's an airplane. And they look at you like you're nuts. And there was a bird flying over there, a little bit bigger. And I said, looky over there, there's another airplane. And they all, oh man, that's a bird, And then go back to the sandpaper A this big. Give me a break. It's not a question of visual discrimination. It's a question of what you taught them and how they learn to discriminate it. So that you have those guys. Then you have the one that bothers me perhaps most of all is the notion of dyslexia. That slowly we're moving toward the direction that there is a dystechia, and that kids are logical, and that what they have mislearned, they have been mistaught. But it's really, really slow. And you still go into classrooms, and there's still tons of information printed on dyslexia. And we've shown for the past 34 years that if kids are taught properly in kindergarten, you don't have non-readers. There are no non-readers. I've never seen a kid, with an IQ in the range of 80 or above that couldn't be taught to read in a timely fashion. And I've, taken on various comers that said, oh, this kid has no visual perception and like that. They can all be taught to read if you start where they are and you provide a sequence that's going to teach them systematically. But what does it take for them to let go of this? And I know it's all tied up with funding. It's all tied up with this. It's like specific learning disabilities. They're getting close to kicking those out, hopefully. But of all the absurd categories or labels, that has to be among the worst. Because how do you know the kid has a specific learning disability? Because he can't read. Why can't he read? Because he's got a specific learning disability. I see. That makes a lot of sense now. Perfectly circular logic.
And when you add to that, the biggest, I had this conversation with James Wendorf. I mean, the biggest learning disability in the country is the process of learning to read.
Yeah. Well, if they were to measure, for instance, like get serious about, dyscalculia, arithmetic, inability to perceive arithmetic, I guess, they would find out it's a biggie too. You have, like we work with, this is sort of off the subject because we're talking about reading, but we work with this group of kids who had gone through this kind of program where every day the teacher would present a new problem and the kids would have to figure it out through guess and check and make up some algorithm or like that. And mid-year, after working with these kids on stuff that was on their level, they're placed properly, kids would still do this kind of thing all the time, raise their hand, and you go over and say, well, what's the problem? And they point to this. They say, I don't know how to work this problem. And you'd look at it and you'd say, well, that's just the kind of problems we worked yesterday. You remember those? Yeah. Do you remember how we worked them yesterday? Yeah. Well, you say, you mean you want me to work it the same way I worked it yesterday? No kidding. That's how totally... The kids don't understand that the reason they invented math in the first place was so they could avoid all that guess and check stuff, and they could do it systematically. And it was true, and it was universal, and it would happen today and tomorrow. Same problem, same solution. Same class, same approach. Give me a break. But yeah, no, they're totally crippled. In math, I mean,
the point was, going back to your dystechia, or whatever you call it, which I really like. I mean, what both of us, I think, are really hot about right now is that the biggest learning disabling thing happening to our culture is our approach to teaching.
Yeah, that a kid can know nothing about arithmetic and you could talk to him for 2 days and not know that there's a problem. But, a kid with a reading problem, depending on the situation you're in, you can find out real quick that they have a reading problem. And it's very handicapping. And they feel really bad.
And it's easier to get through life trying to hide your aversion to mathematics than your aversion to reading.
Oh, yeah. Yes. Well, okay. But
good. More, you got some more 2 sentences. Well, let's hear them. Let's go.
The whole thing on dyslexia is that they can't, they try to make it a property of the kid. Like some years ago, I think it might be changing now, but very slowly, this guy, Galen Alessi, did this paper in which he diagnosed diagnosis. And what he did was he took case studies for about 1,000 kids that were diagnosed as having specific learning disability. So he presented those who provided the diagnosis with a number of questions, like, this is just about diagnose. What are the or why are kids diagnosed? And he had a whole bunch of options, including inappropriate teaching, school program, failure to identify like problems in a timely manner. And it was never any of the above. It was always the kid. The kid was always the problem, and never was the establishment responsible for the problem. And it's still kind of like that with dyslexia. Are you talking about, and this is where I guess that some of that brain MRI stuff comes in and is useful to show people that know Virginia, that when a kid learns to read better, his brain patterns change. It's not that he has inherited some kind of goony dyslexia, but they don't know what it is, and they certainly don't know how to take evidence. What does it take? Here, we work in classrooms with kids who have, IQs below 100. They're from impoverished areas, and they have a history in those schools of enormous school failure, kids not learning to read, and yet they can all read by the end of the year. I mean, isn't this a far more likely place to have dyslexia? Anymore, they argue not so, that there are two kinds. There are these types who can't read because of environmental conditions, and those who have dyslexia. I mean, a real condition. Well, if they exist at such a small number that it's infinitesimal, and you don't need all of the support groups and all of the kind of like accoutrements that go with dyslexia.
Those things are driven by parent groups and by legislators about how they can identify and tag certain kids for certain kind of support.
Right.
And the law says if there's something inherently wrong with you, then we want to help you. But
Right.
if you're a casualty of growing up
Right.
in your environment or our school systems,
Right.
sorry, even though your disability, quote unquote, is effectively the same, we're not going to take any responsibility for that.
Right.
Which is tied to socioeconomics as well.
Oh,
What
yeah.
you're saying.
Oh, yeah.
If you don't have a parent advocate, you're not going to see as much dyslexia in some of these environments
Right.
that you're talking about.
Right.
There aren't parents that are the same money flow isn't going into establishing what
Right.
this problem is with the kid.
But, we need to make teachers advocates for kids, because they're really the only ones who can do a lot of this central advocacy. Like nobody else, no nutrition, no health program, no lawyer, nobody, and no affirmative action of any kind is going to help them learn to read. And a teacher has to serve that advocacy, an important role, but it's not expressed as a role. It's expressed in terms of if the kid does not read, well, the kid has a problem. And that's very unfortunate.
Rather than we need to have a shift that says that children that are suffering to read are a reflection of us.
Absolutely. Right. We have had this motto for years, and it's really despised by IRA people and like that. And it is simply that if the child hasn't learned, the teacher hasn't taught. And within the context of instruction, that's absolutely true, because that's what you're there for, not for the kid to learn, but for you to present whatever sensory input and whatever things are necessary to change that kid's behavior so that the kid reads. And if the kid is not reading, you did not do your end of it correctly. And it needs to be overhauled, scrapped, redone, and recognized right now. Furthermore, like you said earlier, that if if it's not done in a timely manner, what the hell good is it? You need instant identification of problems. Like in the schools we work with, we have weekly phone calls with the school about every classroom, every group, every teacher, and we get updates and where they are, and if there is some assignment that the teacher had been given for specific problems that she had, we need updates on that right now. And we look at every kid in that damn school every week because that's who we're trying to serve. But doing any less than that would be to be remiss in serving as an advocate.
Until such time as the schools develop the kind of discipline and ethic that would do this more for themselves.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that's
all this keeps coming back to is, you and I touched on this in our phone conversation, we're fundamentally misoriented in our general relationship with children and education.
Right.
It's not a little thing.
Right.
We're fundamentally off
Right.
in how we're relating to bringing children through the curriculum.
Right. Right.
And that you're an example of, and your work is an example of what can happen when you step out of all of the mythology and look at what are the objectives and design the steps and design the relationships so as to get the kind of feedback that you need at the frequency level that you need in order to adjust the instruction so that it helps those kids get through.
Absolutely. Yes. And it's, the myths still prevail big time, unfortunately.
Yeah.
They're
The other
hard
side of
to-
it, like we talked on the phone, is that what that leads to the people that don't understand this, is this, gosh, it seems to me like this organization is this evil empire. It's this
Right.
dark controlling force that wants
Right.
us all to sign up and be controlled
Right.
and send in our reports every week. And everything we're doing is like we're
Right.
remote puppets of this guy and his universe.
Right. Yeah. No, right. And yet every feature of the programs that we've designed have been dictated either by problems that kids had or problems that teachers had. Like, I believe I told you on the phone when we first started working with teachers, we didn't have scripts. We didn't have things spelled out in detail. And a teacher would learn to teach by sitting next to me as I taught kids. And then every now and again, I'd turn a task over to her. And it was enormously frustrating. It took like a year for really smart people to become pretty good. Once they got over the hump, they became superstars, and they got very good at it. But the learning all the discriminations about like why that's a bad sequence, why you cannot use a problem with repeated numbers. And when you're teaching, addition, you don't want to use a problem with 2 4s in it or 2 8s, because you want to make sure that the kid, any question you ask will have a very unambiguous response and the kid won't be attending to the wrong number. And just things like that if you work with low performers, you see, whoa, this makes a big difference. If you don't, you never will. But when you get to that level, then you need to have like coherence so that everything you do is pointing to like the kid in terms of her instructional needs, not just necessarily what she wants to do. I mean, it's different from child-centered, it's child reference. Like when we changed the programs, the first thing we did was we'd give them a list of problems or a list of words so they at least get the sequence straight without, doing a bad sequence. And that helped, but they would still get into all kinds of problems. Whenever they went to correct a mistake, they would get wordy, they would get redundant, they would start appealing to things that the kids didn't know. They would try to be intuitive and say, well, look, you can see the difference. No, obviously he can't see the difference or he wouldn't have made that mistake.
But what makes it obvious or not obvious is the degree to which the teacher's general orientation is syncing up with that child rather than
Right.
way back in some map of their own about the assumptions of what's going on.
Yeah, absolutely.
So how do we create environments in where the teacher's learning first person, not theoretical, not by buying into you or to me or to anybody's ideas, but they're first person getting how fundamentally important it is to be able to read, sync up with what's going on inside the child.
Well, the only way that I know how to do that is to do it by the numbers, teach them the things they need to know first, second, third, where they can get to the point where they're not going to just do blind experimentation and be doing things that are crazy and going nowhere. Teachers who are, far from the mark, which, like most of them are, because they've never really been taught technical details of teaching. They've been taught some of them are good at managing kids. Some of them are good at, they have a nice way with kids and they present clearly. But to put it all together so what they're saying has the right timing, says the right things, and is easy to correct and so forth, is in a sequence, the only way you can do that is, or that I know in any reasonable length of time, which is why we arrived at the format we arrived at, is to basically script it, put them through it so that they don't have to attend to all the details of the wording. They don't have to attend to the details of sequence, review, any of that greatly. All they have to do is learn how to interact with those kids. And, there are simple interactions, giving them feedback. There are a little more complicated ones involving corrections. Then there are, quote, motivating ones where you're using information to show them that they're smart and that what they're doing is worthwhile, that they have adopted the role of a good learner, and you really appreciate that, and it's really helping them grow. But you have to do it by the numbers. You can't say that I'm going to show you how to interact with these kids when they don't have the skills necessary to get to the point where the interactions are significant.
Yeah. And it seems to me that we've trained teachers to not be critical first-person learners themselves.
Right.
And so how can they bring that about in the other kids if it's an alien practice to their own process?
Well, I think the big problem is that people don't want to recognize that the teacher doesn't know best. Popular appeals to teachers are, oh, well, you don't do that. You give it to the teacher because the teacher knows best about the individual needs of the children. Baloney, for a couple of reasons. One is, let me think, the standard distribution curve, that on any trait, noses, hair, whatever, you have this curve like that there, with virtually nobody out on the ends and a lot of folks squashed in the middle. And so you're saying right away, that's not true. That's not true of teachers. That with teachers, we have this skewed curve. They're all up on this end. Nobody's down here. Give me a break. The most specific that you could say is a few of the teachers know what's best. And how do you know which ones those are? Go in there and watch them. They're the ones that are making the smart decisions. And then most of them are in the middle somewhere. No, they don't know a lot of things that would make them fill the top category there. And that there's a whole bunch of them. So if we're calling only the adequate ones, the ones who really know best about what's best for the kids, in terms of instructional stuff, we're looking at a very small percentage. Look at it from another standpoint, which is, where have teachers ever demonstrated that they are capable of making up, creating significant programs, like through collaboration, like in Phi Delta Kappa and publications like that? They're so big on collaboration. Well, I'd like to give them a real failed school like in Chicago or Baltimore, and just have them exercise some of their beliefs about collaboration and what teachers are actually capable of learning or are interested of learning or have the capacity to learn in their role. Like, let's face it, a teacher who's busy with kids all day long, it is not often in a position to sit down and want to talk about this program. The feds and the research on reading is terribly guilty of this, that they're forever, including Marilyn Adams, going light years beyond the evidence. So they're always saying things like, okay, like the 2000 report on reading, the panel for reading, right, that they say something like, phonemic awareness comes in various forms, all of which are effective, and a teacher is advised to design the phonemic program she uses by measuring it against measured success. Well, come on. Like, I've done a lot of programs, and we think we're pretty damn smart at putting them together. I have never seen one that we didn't have to revise substantially on the basis of kid performance. Because the kids show us, no, we need a hell of a lot more practice at this. This is apparently not clear, and so forth. This is needed.
So when you deconstruct the instructional sequence, you make certain starting assumptions about how long it's going to take the kids to move from this point to this point. And it turns out that the way that time distributes across the whole thing depends upon where the kids really get hung up. So that's what you're actually trying to pay attention to tune the system.
Right.
Rather than saying, there's something I can pull off the shelf and apply.
Right. Exactly. Well, but with respect to, for instance, teachers doing their own thing on phonemic awareness, first of all, measured success. Like, they know how good it should be. They know how little time it should take up. A lot of these phonemic awareness programs that are as programs, some of them are like 20 hours. 20 hours is way more than we use in our program. We use probably because it's only a few minutes in different lessons. If you include the rhyming stuff that we put in because of some problems that kids have dealing with words that begin with stop sounds, they can't blend them, but when you teach them rhyming of a certain type, the ending's at, so this word's going to rhyme with at, and it's going to start with this letter. What letter? Okay, rhyme with at and start with what word? Nailed. Otherwise, they have a hell of a time, because going from k to at, and they had all kinds. Anyhow, but
you had a question that intersects here before we leave this space, yeah?
Go ahead and finish your thought.
All right, sorry.
Okay, on this phonemic awareness stuff, that even if the teachers had a good basis of comparison, if they had a good basis of comparison, they would say, why the hell am I doing this? I'm never going to get it down to where it's only going to take, maybe for the whole year, 2 hours and 35 minutes. I'll never get it there. If they have a poor basis for comparison, then what are they doing? They're designing a crummy program, a little bit better than what they got, but crummy. If you have to spend big time on a lot of that stuff for pre-readers, something's wrong with what you're doing. And it probably is that much of it is discontinuous and unnecessary for the next steps these kids would have to take in instruction. But even if we overlook all of those, how many times would a teacher have to try the program out to get comparative data? Given that the teacher has one batch of kids this year and one batch next year, I mean, she could get very ambitious and do different programs with different groups. But come on, I mean, here we've got an instructional designer now staying up to 4 o'clock in the morning, in addition to doing all the other things the teacher has to do. I mean, drop the miss of the teacher and please, let the feds get it together and recognize that these, here's what the feds need to recognize, I think, that if you're going to say teachers should do things like that, that describes a very simple experiment. You got your comparison group, you got your experimental group, and you just have them do things like that to see what their actual behavior is. And you'll find that they will try to look for something that's already done, period. Period. But don't take my word for it. Run the program. But this all starts with a false assumption that teachers know better. No, teachers need enormous training, even those that are quite good. If they're trained, if they haven't been trained in really, how to teach super well, they will benefit from it. And it's all quite teachable.
My question is, I went into a school and talked with the reading coordinator. They were using reading mastery. And we talked about it, and how's the script working? I'm starting to explore this, and she says, "Oh, I love it. My teachers, they don't even have to think." This was the response.
Yeah.
I love it. They don't even have to think
Well,
about what they're doing.
no.
So where does that fit in? But then also, how does, I'm interested in how direct instruction curves around. The reading coordinator might come and take a training class, right? Or be exposed to some training through you. And then is it her responsibility to go back and train the teachers beyond just the script? I mean, that was a scary thing to me, to say, I love it. My teachers don't even have to think about it.
Well, number one, that can't possibly be true because you're not doing a solo act. It's not a monologue, it's teaching. That you're presenting tasks to the kids, and depending on how they respond, that determines the next thing you're going to do. That if they respond correctly, you're going to reinforce that response and move on. If not, you're going to go back and you're going to correct it so they're able to do that correctly. Okay, this is not brain dead activity. I'm sorry, this requires attention. Teachers are often not very good at that. They can't hear the responses. Their pacing is wrong, so that they have a group that is led by some kids. Like if there's anything that really kills learning in kids, it's when a group response cannot function for the teacher as giving information about all the individuals. So a group response is like an individual response that's done 8 times as fast if you have 8 kids in the group. All right, that's what it is. And that's how it functions from the standpoint of information. But if you have one where the teacher's timing is bad, everybody, what word? Some kid, man, or they'll fake it like a man, could be mad, it could be anything. Or if some of them are coming in at different times, whoa, all you know about, if the response is correct, is that the first kid that responded did it correctly. The rest, all bets are off because they could have been copying the responses. So for them to do it right, to perform minimally in interacting with those kids, there is one heck of a lot that they have to learn, and a heck of a lot they have to practice.
It's an orchestrated synchrony.
Right. And it takes like at least 4 days to teach, teachers from scratch so that they have a sufficient background. And then it requires checkouts on full lessons, to where the teacher does a full lesson and checks out on it. And then in the schools we work with, they have to check out on that same lesson in the classroom. When they get to that point in the program, or we have a group that's at that point, they have to check out on that lesson so that they can see the difference between teaching kids and just practicing in mock practice groups in a training session, where they'll go over the script. They'll receive information about information about their timing, their pacing, their stress, how they're presenting the task, how they're responding to the other teachers who are playing kids. But no, it is not. The hardest thing for people to learn are things that are not in a rote sequence. If it's in a rote sequence, like a poem, then it's easy for them to learn. But if it requires, you have to do something after that person does something, and you don't know exactly what that person's going to do, so you have to be ready with a repertoire of responses that is hardly, that's hardly sort of like automatic or stupid responding. You are responding to the kids. You're not making up the words, but you're delivering the words in a way that are clear to the kids. You're not making up the examples or the sequence of the examples, but you're presenting them in a way that the kids show you through their behavior that they're getting it. And you're not making up the responses. So if the responses don't come out as the correct response, you have to respond to that. And then, but if the reading coordinator, if that's what she learned and that's what she passed on to the teachers, that they're probably not going to all do it the right way. On the other hand, tell you a story. In Providence, Rhode Island, we had this awesome follow-through site in the late 60s and 70s. And in this one school, we weren't doing the whole school. We were doing only K through 3, because that's what follow-through covered. And there was a teacher in the school who was sort of a queen bee, and she was, considered the reading expert for the school. And we, of course, weren't doing it her way at all, and she hated the program. And at this one party one time, she started, pontificating along the lines of people are just robotic, following the script, and this and that. And there was this first-year teacher who, after a while, she said, Marilyn, I have to stop you. I mean, you know more about reading than I'll probably ever know. You know all that linguistic stuff, this phonology and all those things you talk about. You're really very learned. And I respect that a lot. But my kids perform as well as your kids, and you know it. And your kids are a grade above mine. And that kind of shut the water off right there. And she said, for her bottom line was, and all I know how to do is say what it says in red and do what it says in black. That's all I know about teaching reading, because I certainly never learned it in college. So, I mean, no, but it's not a stupid activity. You still have to teach the kids.
I think the distinction that I hear in all of this is the difference between, to what extent, exactly exemplified in your case here, the difference between the teacher having some pseudo-knowledge or some more complete knowledge of what reading is and all of the science, all the things that are involved in understanding reading, or they are executing, they are part of the extension of a program in which they're gathering feedback, they're modifying and adjusting within certain parameters, but they are not trying to be de novo reading experts and teachers. And the difference, though, because I'm fine with it up to that point, is that perhaps rather than being converts in this almost religious propagated or knowledge worker sign-off model where I don't really understand it, but I'm just going to do it.
Yeah.
The place to ground that is that they're a first-person learner and that they are concerned with the quality of participation that's going on in the child, and that they've found a way to recognize how this system plugs into their own first-person learning, their own first-person participation, and the first-person participation of the children that they're responsible for, and that then glues this together, rather than, I don't really care about what's going on in the children, I don't really care to understand it, but I'm a soldier on the edge of executing my instructions.
Right. And from their standpoint, that's what you want them to learn. From a different standpoint, I can't tell you how painful it is to go into a classroom and see teachers doing bumbling things and kids not reading, and you want to scream, you want to grab them by the neck and say, don't you know that what you're doing is stupid? Come on, man, you're killing that kid. You are preventing that. You're ruining that kid. Why are you doing that? You wouldn't beat him up on the playground. Why are you so stupid? But I mean, to see them, and if they had a script in their hand and you gave them 4 days of practice, they could at least do that kid intelligently. They could place that kid and they could learn something.
In the absence of somebody who's on and trying to learn their way into sync with the participation errors of a student, I'd much rather have them following a good script than fuzzing about in the.
And you hope they learn it.
Yeah.
I mean, you hope that it's and we try to let our teachers know that this is a really important job you're doing, and that a good teacher has a unique contribution, and we really appreciate the hell out of what you're doing when you teach all those kids, because it's not just that you're pleasing us. You're changing lives for kids in ways that nobody else can do.
This comes back kind of to where we started in a way that, I say, look at your water. This is a good time. Whenever I'm talking, you can drink all you want. That are, like you and I said on the phone, I mean, there's just nothing more important given any long-range view of human problems, culture problems, the dilemma that human beings face in the world, than stewarding the health of the learning of the children.
Absolutely.
I mean, that is the ground of everything in the future.
Right.
Not what they're learning about in particular, that's important, but the overall health of learning is what connects to the future more than any particular thing.
And a lot of, for instance, what teachers say is not true. Like we did a study with third, fourth, fifth grade teachers in teaching. It was reading, and they used different programs. They were in different schools, but all of the schools had lower performing kids. And the teachers on their verbal reports, we asked, how closely do you follow your program? And they would say, not all that closely. Virtually none of them said to the letter. And yet when we watched them teach, we taped them teaching, I believe 3 times during the year, they followed it enormously closely. And we told them the lessons that we were going to tape, and we said, we don't care, we just want to see the way you normally teach. Well, don't do anything special for us. And it was so bad because they followed it so closely, and they were so handicapped because they couldn't recognize what the problems really were. Like, I remember this one classroom where this was classic, talking about misrules, that they're teaching main idea, and we checked them out on main idea sequencing, inference, all that stuff that they're supposed to teach. They failed all of it pretty miserably, and not just some teachers. It was all pretty sad. But this one, they're reading this passage about the railroads going west, and some of it going from the west. But the first paragraph they read had a topic sentence as the first sentence in the paragraph. And so the teacher asked, well, what's the main idea of that paragraph? These are words right out of the text that she apparently studied. And a couple of kids guess, and then someone reads off the first sentence. That's it. That's right. Okay, and the next one was the same form. And blah, blah, blah. Okay, more hands go up. On the first one, only a few hands went up. On the second one, a lot of hands go up. And calls on the first kid, gets it right. The third one had the topic sentence as the last one in the paragraph. So they read that paragraph, and then, okay, who knows the main idea? Hands go up, and not as many, but almost as many, almost all of them. And she calls on somebody, reads the first sentence. And no, and said, that's one of the things that happen, but that's not the main idea. What's the main idea? So kids try different sentences. Finally, somebody calls out the last one. And she says, yes, see, that's the main idea. It told about all the diseases, blah, blah, this and that. And then so the next paragraph had no topic sentence. So the kids read it, and they read it, all the hands go up, right? Okay, so calls on the first kid. First sentence, she said, well, that's one of the things that happened, but what's the whole main idea? What's the whole main idea? You've got part of the main idea, but what's the whole? So the kids, the furrowed foreheads, the thought, the scratches, they're looking for that damn whole main idea. Must be here somewhere. So another kid, and she reads the last sentence, and she said, teacher, well, that's another thing that happened, but what's the whole main idea? And this went on till they had exhausted every sentence in that paragraph, and finally the teacher said, well, the whole main idea is this and this and that. And all the kids are looking like that, like this. And in other words, what the hell are you doing this for? Why do you stipulate it's a sentence on 3 examples and then throw this hooker at us? Like, come on, what's this game? And I mean, not one kid in that group knew what the hell was going on.
They were trained to look for a particular
Absolutely.
way of extracting that meaning.
And we asked her about the program, and I said, well, what was wrong with that program? How should it have been sequenced? And she couldn't come up with any concrete way. She didn't know that, whoa, if that's what you want to teach, that's the first paragraph that way. And it's designed so, it's a simple thing. First, he took his shoe from under the bed, then he put his socks on, then he put his shoe on, then he tied his shoe. Give me a summary sentence of what he did. He put on his shoe, He put on his socks and shoe. Good,
this comes back to unfolding the challenge and minimizing the extraneous ambiguity.
Absolutely. I mean, that's what it all is. I mean, if you don't have that, you don't have squat. That you can have all the accoutrements, and that's where they are now.
But you can get at that by just caring about how children learn. You don't have to be some scientist about all this stuff. I mean, you can either get that from first-person attention to your own learning,
right,
or you can get that by observing
right,
any child. But you can't. But I think one of the big problems is that teachers have learned not to do either.
Well, it's hard for them to do. It's just, we just have to face the fact that it's hard for them to create corrections to things. They know their kids are having trouble, and they can tell you what they're having trouble with. They're not, schooled in how you would use inferences to figure out how you fix it up. Like if they knew some rules, if they had been taught that, they'd be able to do it. But if they'd been taught it, they'd throw out 98% of the programs they've got. They'd say, whoa, this really stinks. Let's revise it.
Doesn't this come back, though, to rather than thinking that the objective is this corpus of specifications, I got to do this, we got to do this, we got to do this, we got to do this, that there's this overarching concern, this kind of trumping all the rest of it, that's contextualizing all the rest of it, that the most important thing that we're trying to do is to bring forth a coherent quality of participation from the inside out in this child,
right,
so that we can hook into that,
right,
and we can engage that,
right,
and unfold these challenges, right, and so forth in the way that we're talking about. And that's the center line that we're staying on. Absolutely. While we bring in all the rest of these objectives. And if we don't have that, we're lost.
Absolutely. But from the standpoint of someone doing it or designing it, it is scientific, and it is abstract to the point that you're following rules. You're starting with this premise: I ought to do whatever I can to make the learning of that child successful, eminently efficient, and reinforcing to him, period.
Which means, in order to do that, if I double click on that and go deeper, it's the quality of their participation.
Right.
I've got to make contact with their participation.
Right, but see, that's where, that's where it all falls down. Because they think making contact means establishing rapport.
We're talking about synchronous contact on the edge of these challenges.
Absolutely. That you need to know where they are, so you need to know, or so you can present stuff that is not precipitous for them, but that stretches them a little bit. And that they'll be able to succeed, so they succeed at a high enough rate. Like if they succeed on 75% of what they do, even, like on new learning material, we say they got to be 70% first time correct. They know they are far more likely to get it the first time than they're not.
Right, and this connects back to the emotional piece. When I brought up the emotional piece, we went into somewhat of a tangential response, which was how that gets distorted. A concern for emotionality gets distorted into trying to make everything feel good.
Right.
But it's not the positive side of that concerns me, and what we're talking about
It's
here.
the avoid,
It's the negative side.
yeah.
It's what happens if we're not meeting them in a way that's instructionally necessary for who they are, and they learn to develop a negative emotional affective response. That undermines everything. I mean, the core of our thing, and I want you to comment on this, is this. It's this simple. And I think this is where you and I really meet. We've created a situation in which our children are experiencing a uniquely unnatural kind of confusion. It's a kind of confusion that this organism didn't grow up doing, didn't evolve to deal with.
Right.
It's a cultural, social, technological kind of confusion that's not natural to the organism, on the one hand. On the other hand, because of how we contextualize that and how we instruct, meet, parent, the whole field around children, as they're experiencing this confusion, they're learning to feel as if this confusion is a reflection of something wrong with them.
Absolutely.
And as they start to feel shame in relation to confusion, then they want to start avoiding being confused, feeling confused, pre-consciously, faster than conscious. So when children want to avoid feeling confused, it's decapitating learning.
Right. Yeah, no, they will escape from the situation one way or another.
Well, this seems to be to me, this seems very centrally misperceived, not understood in the education community.
Well, see, it's misunderstood, I guess, largely because they wouldn't know what to do about it if they saw it. I mean, if they knew that that's what they were doing, they don't know exactly how to undo it because they have so many, or there are such pandemic misconceptions about what kids are and how they learn.
We've gone down the track with the self-esteem movement where people thought that it was possible to pump up somebody's positivity absent their actual experience from the inside of effectiveness. What I hear you saying is look, let's discard that. That doesn't go anywhere. Kids feel good when they know that they're able to meet the challenges that they're actually faced with, right? And that there's no fooling them about that. Right.
Well, kids are very lawful. I mean, they're as lawful as daylights. If you know how they respond to reinforcement and you know how they respond to failure, you can predict what they're going to like, how you can turn them on, and you can have a lot of fun working with them because you don't have to be afraid of them, and you don't have to be uncertain about things. You know what they're going to do as a function of what you do, and if they do something and you want to correct that, how you can do it in a way that it's in a timely manner, and it's not anything that's going to have serious engrams on their growth or their self-image. But no, see, like one of the things that when we did follow-through, that the Office of Education was most surprised about was that our kids had the highest scores on tests of self-image, that they had the strongest self-image and the strongest sense of responsibility for their own learning. And they were amazed at this because we didn't talk about that stuff. And we knew that if we did our job, of course the kids would. Kids are data-based. They're just like that dog in the rainstorm, that there's a basis for what they learn. And if you present things that are ambiguous because of their structure or ambiguous because of the way you present them, some kids, not all of them, but some of them are going to learn it in a way that's perfectly consistent with that misrule. All of them will learn what's consistent with your presentation. Period. That's the overriding rule. Some of them will learn things that are consistent with parts of your presentation that are unintentional. For instance, like if you did this, if you went into a classroom and you taught non-readers to read all words that were CVC and sound them out or identify them or whatever. And then you, after you do that to where they've really firmly learned this, and then you present a word that is VC or CV, consonant, vowel, or vowel, consonant, a large percentage of the kids will try to put a third sound on that word. Period. Why? Because that is what you taught them. It doesn't matter what your theory of learning is. All you need to do is look at the facts of what you did and the facts of what they're doing, and they're showing you with their behavior that they expect that to always be a three-sound word. In other words, if there are words other than three-sound words that they're going to read, why the hell didn't you introduce it earlier? Why didn't you show them the range of variation so they wouldn't have this stipulation error? It's just like one of the ones that we've done lots of times with preschool kids, just to show, how you can intend to teach one thing and you're going to teach another. Is you go into a classroom where a teacher has taught a kid, beginning kids, preschool kids, kindergarten kids, to count. And they always teach them to count first to a small number. And that number is always 3. Count to 3. 1, 2, 3. Good. You counted to 3. Again, count to 3. Oh my, good. Good job. So you reinforce the hell out of them for doing that. And then if you come in when they're really firm in that and you say count to 7, a percentage of the kids, not all of them, will say 1 to 7 because that's what you taught them. They will generalize on the basis of the pattern. Yeah, or in the word 2. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 7. When you count to 7, 1, 2, 7. Count to 3, 1, 2, 3. But you taught it. And if you don't recognize that, you're in trouble.
That comes back to you've got to pay a different kind of attention to the correspondence between your instruction and what's being learned and how the children are participating. What kind of errors are a consequence of the participation you're calling for and how you're instructing.
Right. And you have to... Oh, sorry.
It's okay. I'm just picking it up in the...
Okay, sorry. That you have to take any of their errors as information about something you did wrong. And, you may explore the possibilities and say, well, I didn't do anything wrong. And then you're stuck with it. But in most cases, you will find out you did something wrong, that it was your fault, not their fault.
If you're learning oriented in your teaching.
Right. But I mean, the problem, in getting that to teachers, it'd be wonderful if we had a system where they really learned about teaching, where they had the opportunities that we did, which is to work with kind of hard to teach kids who didn't know a lot, who were preschool age, and who would make every kind of mistake imaginable. And then you would learn all about mistakes. You'd learn all about correcting them. You'd learn all about the cost of not correcting them in a timely fashion. You'd learn about all of the ways to buttress against mistakes, how you can do it with timing, how you can do it with pattern, how you can do it with pacing, and how you can do it spuriously, and how you can do it without any spurious cues. And then when you get there, now you're in a position to make some really intelligent decisions about how you're going to configure instruction.
Well, what right here, one of the things that seems to keep teachers, I mean, obviously teachers are like the rest of us, and they make an investment in their identity as a teacher and a particular way of doing things that they, as we start to talk about some of these other things, pushes against that in a way that they don't feel very good about and that they want to recoil from. There's a shame aversion to, what do you mean I'm wrong in how I'm teaching?
Right.
Right? That's one piece of it.
Right. But I mean, if you can't correct it, what good does it do to tell?
Part of the way that loops in, it seems to me, that prints the license for that kind of thinking is, well, I care about the whole child, not just this robotic conformance to, the assessments and measurements of the education system.
Right.
There's a failure to understand the self-esteem negative consequences of the way we're doing things.
Right.
There was a failure to understand
Right.
the enormous emotional, sociological, behavioral consequences of the fact that we're disabling the learning in most of our children because of our ignorance and negligence in the way that we instruct.
Yeah. I agree. And I mean, it's sort of like a vicious cycle because you can't blame teachers for not knowing what they don't know. They have never been taught it, they've been taught misrules, or they've been taught totally superficial stuff. They've never been brought to a hard criterion in working with kids, particularly hard to teach kids. And a lot of them are reinforced because they work now with higher performing kids. And if you do a reasonable job and they're not beginning level kids, you'll get by that they will learn passably, often well. And I'm not saying that there aren't good teachers with older kids. I'm saying that the kind of knowledge you need to work with the failed kid or the beginning reader who's hard to teach, or the beginning reader that shouldn't be hard to teach but is because he or she happens to just be one that picked up on the miscues or that the teacher gave them and trying to follow the bad advice that the teacher gave, is now very confused. But to get them to that point,
I think we have to start by saying, look, it's not your fault. I agree with where you're going. I don't think it's the teacher's fault. I think it's a transmissional problem that's multi-generational. And if it indicates anything, it indicates a lack of leadership in the learning sciences, in science in general, and in educational policy.
Right. Well, right. And most of all in instruction, that, like the bottom line for instruction, instructional theory, and all of the accoutrements are strictly based on environmental variables. In other words, what did you put in there? What was your dependent variable? What is the specific behavior of the kids? Don't give me some general glop. Don't give me a grade level. Give me response by response to task by task. And that's the information that you really need to be a good diagnostician.
So on the one level, you got to black box it, and on the other level, the black box has to be grounded in an understanding of learning.
Yeah.
Right.
And basically what you can expect from the kids, what's reasonable anticipation, what's not, what you can hope for them to achieve in a 20-minute period.
Well, we just ran out our second hour of tape.
Okay. Well, did you want to do more? Or?
I feel really good that we've covered everything. Let's take a second as a threesome and talk about what we didn't cover that we'd like to see whether or not we should tee up another tape. And how are you feeling to have a water and pretzel and all that kind of stuff?
Okay, let me think.
Whether you come at this from a point of view of, this is the miracle to me, whether you come at this from a point of view, as many do, of an utter disregard for the interior life and experience of the children. You come at this like we're harvesting crops. We're harvesting the bot crops we need for our economy and our society, and we really don't give a damn about what's going on inside them. We don't care about that. Or we come at this from the perspective of this compassionate, loving care for who they are as human beings, and helping them find their way into the world in a way that they can be authentically who they are, while finding opportunities in the world that nourish who they are and allow them to be successful and happy. And that's what our primary concern is. You end up in the same place.
Right.
That's a profound miracle to me.
Right.
So there is a violent agreement that hasn't been able to happen yet. I mean, there's an implicit agreement that just hasn't been bridged between these different factions.
Right. And I think a lot of it just has to do with expectations. That the rhetoric is often one thing and the actual expectations are different. That, they talk about all kids learning to read, and, like with when whole language was popular, they had all kinds of slogans about how kids learn to read by using language, and we read to kids and learning to read through literature and all this stuff. And on the one hand, they'll say all this stuff. On the other hand, they apparently don't know what they're looking at when they look at kids, or they would never say that. They would say, wow, literature is a real pain in the ass for beginning reading because it has such weird language sometimes.
Yeah, the language has not been considerate of the startup aspects of the challenge of learning to read.
Right.
When that wasn't what was written.
And it would be stupid prose even if they could decode all the words, like what's a tuffet?
Yeah.
Give me a break. Sat on her tuffet, eating her curds and whey. Oh yeah, sure, I know what all that's about.
I just did that yesterday.
Yeah. No, but it's like that there are two standards. One drives everything, and it's totally philosophical for some people, that they're really not looking at the kids. Or if they do look at kids, it's selected kids, like maybe, really smart kids who flatter the daylights out of them by doing the things that they say all kids should be able to do. But they're sure not looking at a lot of the kids that we work with. And if they had and seriously looked at them, and they were concerned at all, had any kind of comparative idea of what these kids could achieve, they would think differently. But I don't really think they have a good comparative idea of what these kids could really do.
But let's not talk about the experts or leaders of these tribes that go off and to the left and the right of the things. But rather, what is the glue that bonds the following, right? I mean, the people that have bought into these alternative systems, why did they buy into them? Well, they bought into them because it makes them feel good, like they're not bad for what they're doing. And two, it lines up with their sense of what it means to be responsible to a child. Maybe not in the granular, not in the particulars that we're talking about, but in the warm fuzzies, it feels like, gee, that's the right way to be responsible to stewarding this child. That's a good energy for us to build a different bridge into.
Right. Well, to do that, step one would be teacher training. Absolutely.
Step one seems to be teacher orientation.
I don't know. Okay, we've done a lot of different teacher training formats. Like for our model, we have to train instructional aides to actually do just pretty exactly what the teacher is doing in the classroom often. They'll teach a group, and they'll follow the same criteria for teaching that the teacher would. Have to learn the same kind of things. So that, we know what it takes to teach them. The best, easiest to teach, smartest group I ever worked with was a group of high school students in a disadvantaged neighborhood, and these kids had a program where they could earn college credit. They were seniors, except for two of them. They could earn college credit for working as aides in our classroom. So we made them all, we put them through the regular teacher training stuff. they were flat awesome because they had no misrules, no misconceptions. They believed what we told them in the training. They were not
They're
like
virgins, to use your expression from earlier.
and they weren't like corrective readers that had to unlearn a whole bunch before they could learn anything. They were just, okay, that makes sense. And we showed them, yeah, you can have fun with the kids, darn right. And you can present in a way that's interesting. And when you get your timing down and things are okay, you're doing things just right, everything goes well. Whoa, you're having fun. The kids like it. The rhythm is good, and here we go. And they were awesome. They learned faster than any group I ever worked with.
I would argue that they were not yet misoriented.
Exactly.
So that comes back to the ground of this has to be an orientation, bringing teachers into an alignment to what is my responsibility to children, what is my responsibility to the instructional system, how do I integrate those two?
But you can't, okay, I mean, the problem comes, it starts with teacher training, but it goes all the way into when they're in the school. Like if you have, there are schools that we worked with, for instance, in California, that were forbidden from using DI, where the administration collected the boxes and threw it out. And they monitored they monitored the classrooms to make sure that teachers were not doing that awful thing. Now, these people obviously sincerely believed that we were doing something that was dangerous and horrible to kids. But somehow you have to have enough control over teacher training to let them know that if you are providing for the needs of the kids, instructional needs, and if you're doing it in a way that's quite graceful, very efficient, doesn't take a lot of time, and is quite effective, that's evidence of your concern, because you know that if it's not done that way, you're going to punish them to various degrees.
Right, but that comes back to, does the teacher get that? Does the administration get that? Does the administration get the psychological, developmental damage that's happening by not using effective instruction?
Well, they don't want to face it for sure, because they can't. Otherwise, the true traditional teacher, it would be something like this. You'd go into the classroom at the end of the year and you'd say, what did you teach this year? Oh, I taught reading. Okay, what evidence do you have that you taught reading? Janie, come on up here, read to the man, Okay, Alex, your turn. And on, and say, well, that's pretty good evidence. What about those kids over there? Oh, they can't learn.
They can't learn.
They can't learn.
Right.
In other words, whatever I do is prima facie justification that it's right because of the single reason I did it.
Right. So I select the evidence that confirms my belief system.
Right. I did it. I did that. I was teaching reading. If they didn't learn it, those little son of a bitches can't learn. Period. And I I don't like to be insulted. Like, which kids do teachers like best?
Yeah, but that's where we got to come in and say, okay, look, all the evidence suggests that over 95%, and you would say 99.9% of the children can read if they're met in relation to what they need on the ramp to reading.
But see, if they were to accept that, then they'd have to accept that they are horrible individuals.
No, that they are, ignorant and of the transmission they're caught in about how they're oriented to teaching.
Right. Well,
that makes them not responsible in a way. That makes them responsible as they learn to shift, but not at fault for what's happened.
When I work with teachers in a school, the first thing I tell them is you got to get this straight. Two things. One, teaching is acting. You're not doing what you feel like doing any more than a surgeon who's doing quadruple bypass does what he feels like doing. He might prefer...
It's a professional discipline.
Yeah, play golf or do an easier operation. What about a tonsillectomy? And the only reason he's doing that is because that's his professional responsibility. So the first thing you have to recognize is that you do what you do because it's effective for the kids. The second thing you have to remember is, and get this and never forget it, no favorites. On company time, you may not have favorites. Every single kid there is equal. Every single kid there. Now, I mean, if you don't like them on your own time, that's fine. I mean, that's your business.
Yeah, it's very
but when
difficult
you're
for
working
human beings
with
to
them,
be that way. But yeah,
but no, you have to interact with them the same way you would with the top kid. And the third rule is that we'll show you patterns of interaction that are appropriate, those that are inappropriate, and you'll use the former, not the latter. But no favorites, absolutely no favorites. And that's the hardest thing, because they tend to like kids that flatter them. Kids that get it, oh, I like her. She's such a nice, well-behaved young.
Which leads the children, because the children pick that up, leads the children to want to be buttering up to the teacher as their mode of success.
Right.
Yeah, it's very crazy making.
If they learn like the professional parameters of a teacher and what it encompasses, then the second has to do with expectations. And like all these kids can learn if we teach them properly. You remember that. I don't care what your past experience has been with them. They can all learn if we teach them properly. They can learn math, they can learn science, they can learn whatever reasonable disciplines we try to teach. And then, but one of the big things that I notice, the people that trainers, supervisors that I've taught and that have worked with us, I shouldn't just say me, have a passion that is not shared by people who are trained second and third hand. For them, it's a technique. But for us, for instance, like when you do a school and you're doing school-wide discipline, the first rule that teachers have to know is every single kid in this school is your kid. Got it? It doesn't matter if the kid's misbehaving outside the classroom. That's your kid as long as he's in this school. So you think of that kid that way, and you think of them all that way, and then things will go a lot easier, and you'll have a more ecumenical perspective about what this is all about. We're all in it together. We're all contributing to the welfare of that kid. You're doing it in the second grade. You're doing it in the sixth grade. But those are our kids, and it doesn't matter whether we do the reading, someone else does the math. If someone else doing the math is doing it wrong, your moral obligation is to point that out to them or to a supervisor or someone who can help them do it the right way, because you don't want to see your kid taught poorly.
Rather than this stratified, this lot is now your problem, not my problem.
Yeah, right, exactly. Well, some of them, when the kid walks out of the room, can be doing crazy stuff or be in seat work when another aide's in charge of seat work and be doing something totally wrong. And the teacher will walk right by, observe it, and do nothing about it. That's your kid. You can't do that.
Let me bring us to a close with two questions of mine, and then an opportunity for you to close with anything you think we haven't talked about. And I want these to be short and crisp, as best as you can.
I will try.
All right. First thing, what is learning?
Okay, well, that's a good one. Learning is an acquisition of information that can direct various behaviors, including like motor behaviors, operant responses, but it all is based on knowledge. So that learning is the acquisition of knowledge that you didn't have before, but that you will have tomorrow and the day after, and you will be able to apply to some specific situation.
Okay. Tell me about the heartbeat, the engine, the core process of learning, or whatever you would say about that. What's the inner dynamic of human learning?
Well, the inner dynamic has to do with feeling, period. I mean, the whole system has to be run, logically has to be run by feeling. I've got to give you a short answer, so I'll try to do it short. The reason is that you're designed so that certain things cue your behaviors. For it to cue your behavior, it has to cue an operant response. For it to cue an operant response, it has to serve as something like a negative reinforcer that says, in effect, you have to do something to change the tenor or the tone of this situation. And that when that happens, if it gets better, then that was a successful response. But it has to work that way so that the system, the only way that the system can communicate like things that are fundamentally reflexive, like I look at that, holy Christ, that's my Uncle George. No, it's not, it's someone else. But for anything like that to happen, like it has to be involuntary. The knowledge that drives you is involuntary. You also have voluntary knowledge where let's see, what's Lou's birthday? I can do that. But a lot of it is absolutely involuntary. So how do you run, and the fundamental stuff is all involuntary. So how do you run a machine on involuntary input where by definition you can't control the operant responses? You can only do something to elicit that. So that's what the system has to do, is to elicit it, and it does it with feeling. Like when holy Christ, that's my uncle. I felt that. I mean, that was from my guts. I mean, that's Uncle George. Uncle George is a configuration of a whole nexus of feelings.
So this is how our affect system guides what our attention is.
Absolutely, and that's what guides our knowledge. Because if we don't attend to certain things, we're preempted from learning about them.
So with those two as a background, what is reading?
Reading is learning to decode an orthographic code that has conformity, consistency, form. And I mean, you go into, and then it...
You're talking about ideally, or you're talking about English now?
No, I'm talking about it.
When you talk about conformity and consistency.
Well, the word of, even though it's a weird word, of, or oaf, it's always pronounced the same way. So to that extent, it has consistency. And some of the systems have larger generalizations than others, like Italian, Spanish. They're almost pretty all consistent. I mean, there are double C's and things like that that have weird pronunciation and some variation. But when you get to English, I don't know. Of course, I don't know all the languages for sure, but from the ancient languages and from some of the modern languages, I don't know of anything that has more exceptions than reading in English. I mean, English seems to be a total monster, and you can see that if you try to design a program. Like one of the programs we designed, Horizons, which is the basis for the phonics thing, that it goes from letter names to sounds. Like Distar, Reading Mastery, goes from, we just teach the sounds, later we teach the letter names. But with Horizons, we teach them to derive the letter sound from the name, because there are several discrete families of sounds, like there's F and R and N, and in all of those, if you say the name two parts at a time, F, E, N, L, X, if you do that, like the second part is the letter sound. And then there's another group like B, D, G, and those, where B, if you say it a part at a time, B, E, D, E, J, oh dear, there's an exception, and H, oh no, sorry, but a lot of times you'll see readers call H either the ch sound or the h sound or something like that, because they're trying to
So you've
generate.
broken them into classes of,
Right.
of whether the spectrum or spectrum of different sounds and where to pick up that
Right.
sound inside the letter name.
Right, and then once we teach that at the beginning, anyhow, I don't even remember what the point of this was all about.
Well, I was just asking you what was reading.
Oh, that then when you start doing the exceptions, see, in reading mastery, we get rid of a lot of exceptions because we can make macrons and, long lines for the A's and O's, and then treat the short vowel separately. Then all we got to deal with are the exceptions. But the exceptions for the sound of the letter O makes every sound under the sun in different words in English, like other, off, of, gee whiz, and then the O, ooh, gosh. But to program all these in a systematic sequence where you're not just throwing it at them in a way that there's so many exceptions that they tend to think the whole thing is exceptions. I mean, that's the big.
We've got to find a structured stair ramp through those confusions that the kids can stay in.
So it makes some kind of sense.
Right.
And if you stay
without trying to make it have more sense than it does to the child. I mean, one of my problems with a lot of the current movement is that we look at this code from an adult perspective of somebody who's already literate, who already understands it, who's used computers and pattern analysis and hundreds of years of examination and thinking and what have you to develop this kind of sense of the patterns in all of this. But there's a big gap between that and a 4 or 5-year-old whose brain has never encountered any of this stuff and the kind of challenges that child's brain is actually encountering on the road. And how do we bring those two together in a way?
Right. Like BD confusion is a great example. The kid has visual perceptual problems. Oh yeah? I mean, here the kid grew up in his whole life. He never saw an object that changed its name when it changed its position. Like a chair is a chair, whether it's lying down, or there's a wastebasket, there's a cup, there's a pretzel. And yet now all at once, without anybody telling them that here's B and here's D, that it's a position game, and some kids get reversals on that. And what it like if you work with a kid and you put on a transparency, write the letter B, and so you say, okay, this is B. Is it B now? No. Is it B now? Yes. Is it B now? No. Is it B now? No. Is it B now? Yes. And do a few of those and just let them know it's a stupid game. It's only B when it's in a certain position. And goodbye all of this BD confusion, this visual perception problem. It wasn't visual perception. You didn't communicate what it really is. Anyhow.
Excellent. Is there anything else you want to say as we wrap? Because I think we've covered it.
Yeah, I can't think of anything except that I get extremely frustrated at the pace at which the field is moving, because I think they're going fundamentally in the wrong direction with their recommendations that assume that anybody outside of an instructional designer is going to take information on phonics, phonemic awareness, and make a good, sensible program.
Let's hope that the work that Whitehurst is doing in putting the What's Works database together and what have you will help. But yeah, what they're saying is what they're trying to do is avoid
naming programs.
They're trying to avoid naming programs because of the association with economic ties. They're trying to avoid the specific recommendation to commercial programs in particular.
Right.
If these things were not commercial, if there wasn't that commercial stuff, that would be easier.
But I mean,
also ideologically, they're trying to not create a hatchet-like division in the field by creating at least the illusion of choice. I understand what you're saying.
Right. I mean, like, let's do that in the drug business. That'd be great. Now, there's this marvelous drug, and it has these qualities, okay? And if you use it, you'll be able to tell it's working because it does it. What's the name of it? Oh, we don't deal with names, thank you. Or what about, automobiles? I mean, if they would think of this as what it is, are inventions that like flying machines or something, that it won't fly unless all the parts are in there. You don't just have phonemic awareness, phonics, and, a few other. You've got to have it down to, the ritzy-titsy little parts, and they have to be coordinated, and they have to work well. But until they recognize that the game is for someone to build flying machines and for teachers to be damn good pilots, and use this stuff. That they'll never get the game. But like reading a car report, oh, this car cornered better than the others, and it had better mileage and this and that. What's its name? Oh, we don't deal with name. Get the hell out of here. I mean, that's just flat ass bullshit.
I understand.
No, the teachers, and even more so, the teachers will use instructional programs. They're not going to make it up. And for them, and decision makers, like I've had, like what, 30 years later, district superintendents, you talk to them and you tell them about the program. They never heard of follow through. They know nothing about the program. And then when you tell them about the data that we've had, they say things like, now you expect me to believe that you've got this program, you generated all this data, and you're able to teach these kids all that thing, and school districts like mine aren't picking it up? I don't think so. But that's the way it is. I mean, the communication is so poor, but they're operating from the wrong. They're not going to.
But this comes back to orientation. We're misoriented fundamentally.
Right.
The teaching community, the parenting community, all of it.
Right. And we're not, it's not physics. We're not going to go from general principles down to program construction. If anything, we'll go like the Wright brothers now, from the flying machine to general principles. But when you derive those principles, you have principles of instruction in this field, not principles of learning, not principles of child development, not principles of some things that have not anything to do like sociographics.
But the very way that you put that, it could be off-putting to people that are all on about learning and philosophy and child development.
Right.
And the interesting thing is that underlying these differences, there's alignment. There's the potential for alignment.
There is a potential.
And that's where we got to be working.
Right. But I think if you had to boil it down to one thing, one barrier, what is it? Specificity and knowledge of specificity. See, with this other stuff, you can gloss over. You can, kind of like, you can sound good even when you're being bad, because you never have to deal with the concrete examples and the actual consequences that occur in this situation right now. And yet, that's where the action is. That's where all the action.
But in the specifics, it seems can translate down to this inside-out participation and the feedback loop through instruction.
Right.
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 So, but that is a place where we can bring alignment, I believe.
I'm willing to take a shot at it. I mean, it's a tough nut to crack. But I think maybe.
But we got to put our heads in it, just like you were saying about. The dog.
Right.
Right. I mean, we've got to live in that space to learn our way through it.
Well,
we're not going to visit it every 3 or 4 years and make a breakthrough.
Right. No, I agree.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right.
Well, thank you.
Thank you. Let me turn the heat on. We can keep talking.
Okay.